Right now, there are 4 extremely pressing dangers heading towards Germany. That's exactly what I discussed with the chairman of the Employers Association, Dr. Björn Peters, in a highly alarming conversation. We talked about a very questionable energy policy, how it's damaging companies, the dangers of demographics, and of course, Bitcoin. Enjoy listening. We spoke to Björn Peters in a highly alarming conversation about a highly questionable energy policy, where KSM is destroying companies, the dangers of demographics, and of course, Bitcoin. Have fun listening.
And now they also have this really special channel focused on Bitcoin. So all this AI, all these data centers, they consume massive amounts of energy. And that's why I find it totally fascinating. The big asset managers, the BlackRocks and Vanguards of this world, the Goldman Sachs and such, have been banging the drum for ESG criteria for years, saying they'll only invest if it meets certain environmental, social, and governance standards. By the way, I think governance standards are good. So it's just that you don't bribe anyone and you take a bit of honesty to make sure that you do honest business. That's the honorable merchant. In the civil code, that corresponds to that. So that's not so bad at all. But these other social criteria have also been totally misused. So they're asking about the women's quota, which means that a few already very privileged women in 2021 are getting even better jobs on a supervisory board. That's the social criterion. So it has really strayed far from its original purpose, and the environmental standards have completely taken on a life of their own. Around the turn of the millennium, the UN set 17 development goals, most of which are humanitarian in nature, emphasizing that people need access to water, electricity, or energy in general, jobs, food, and of course, housing. And then there are also some general topics, like the need for good institutions. In fact, climate change is also number 13 out of 17, but it has completely taken on a life of its own since 2021. So now let's move on to the data centers. 13 out of 17, but it has completely taken on a life of its own since 2021. So now let's get to the data centers. Microsoft is now looking to reactivate the former nuclear power plant at 3 Mile Island because they need 900 megawatts for their AI data centers. And suddenly, I read this morning that it's probably going to happen in just a few hours. These big asset managers, Goldman Sachs and all the others, are going to announce that they're setting up a financing framework for nuclear energy in the range of about $10 to $15 trillion. So there it is. The wind is changing thanks to the data centers. I'm grateful for the energy demand surge because investors in solar and wind are now considering nuclear power. Nuclear is reliable, clean, and emissions-free. Cooling towers emit only water vapor called cloud machines. It's more cost-effective than weather-dependent sources. That's changing now, and suddenly nuclear power is also a good thing, and I'm on board with that because nuclear energy is reliable, it's extremely clean. Emission-free, so what comes out of the cooling tower is just water vapor, and they call it cloud machines. Nuclear power plants in children's language. Yeah, it's just way more cost-effective for the economy than relying on weather-dependent sources plus storage.
That's super interesting what they're saying, especially about BlackRock, because BlackRock has always had the ESG strategy, but all those ESG funds have totally flopped. They've underperformed big time and so on. And now there's also the consideration that BlackRock is currently heavily investing in Bitcoin, and I don't know how deep they are into the topic, but Bitcoin is often portrayed as an environmental villain or something like that. But if you dive a little deeper, for example, there's even a report out there saying that Bitcoin is actually the ultimate ESG asset because Bitcoin can effectively address the issues we've just discussed. For example, we could monetize excess electricity that would just go to waste, for example, by monetizing it through Bitcoin mining. There are different possibilities. If we take a look, the energy mix of the Bitcoin network is actually greener than the German energy mix. So there is a lot of renewable energy, E.G, hydroelectric power plants and so on, anywhere where electricity is cheap, and the cheapest electricity is simply renewable energies. And that's why maybe BlackRock's strategy right now is to embrace Bitcoin like this. They want to grab this new ESG asset and frame it as an ESG asset so they can greenwash their ESG portfolios again. Can you get on board with that?
Absolutely. I'm Cetragold's father in the gold market for 20 years. 10 years ago, I worried Bitcoin was a hedge against energy markets. If data centers run on weather conditions like sunny Utah or California, it could be a hedge. And I think back then, I don't remember what year it was, but I recall that the total energy consumption of Bitcoin was about the same as that of Denmark. I was always pretty skeptical about whether it would really catch on. But you mentioned it, if you actually run the data centers completely based on weather conditions, like when the sun is shining, especially in places like Utah or California, where the sun shines a lot, then I can see that as a hedge. I just don't know what personal benefit I would get from it, because we have this really dirty energy mix. It's not that hard to have a clean energy mix like Germany. I just don't know what personal benefit I would get from it, because we have this really dirty energy mix. So it's not that hard to have a clean energy mix like Germany. That's a very good benchmark. As a result of the nuclear phase-out, we now have approximately 30 terawatt-hours more CO2-free electricity in the grid since 2000 than we did back then, at a cost of 500 billion euros. If we had used this money to simply further expand the nuclear strategy, we would have built another 20 nuclear power plants for a fraction of the price and would have been completely CO2-free and at very, very low cost. That being said, but I do see it as an argument that if we can manage to mine Bitcoin this way, but like I said, in our area, it's kind of in the mid-troposphere, with only irregular winds, and sometimes even seasonal variations. In solar availability, personally, I wouldn't necessarily invest in it. And then Bitcoin is also something that has artificial scarcity, so the scarcity is embedded in the algorithm, so that it cannot grow. With a gold-backed currency, a purely gold-backed currency, there's this idea that only a certain number of tons of gold are mined from the earth each year, which creates a natural limiting factor for scarcity. That's true, but I'm not sure if that's entirely a good thing, because the economy can grow in many different areas, including services that aren't necessarily energy-intensive or resource-intensive. So, having a currency that can grow a bit along with the economy wouldn't be such a bad thing. The Deutsche Mark had that back then. The principles of the Deutsche Mark were supposed to be imposed on the euro. That worked at first until Gerhard Schroeder and Hans Eichel got rid of it together with the French, who didn't want it anyway. They wanted a soft currency. And so, as long as the central banks are politically under control, such currencies only work for a limited time. But personally, and also due to my lack of knowledge about it, I just don't trust that. Bitcoin will still be a particularly exciting idea in 50 years. So, it has a bit of a longer track record, about 6,000 years.
Yeah, they'll come in when Bitcoin hits 1 million if the price is at 1 million. But theoretically correct, a flexible money supply, etc. But we always see that in practice, the money monopoly gets exploited and manipulated so much that every 27 years, fiat currency hits zero due to hyperinflation or reset. Theoretically, it works with disciplined bankers, but central bankers are just people, and people are greedy. They err. Some governments do well, but others increase money printing. Thus, the problem theoretically nice, but practically it fails. And yeah, in theory, it works if we have disciplined central bankers, but we just have people at the central bank, and people are greedy. They make mistakes sometimes. Maybe 1 or 2 governments do well, but then the 3rd or 4th government comes in and cranks up the money printing machines again. So that's basically the problem I see here. It sounds nice in theory, but in practice, we see that it just doesn't work. And even during the times when we had a direct gold standard from 1817 to 1870, or until around 1911, we had better economic growth, more new inventions, and so on. So I'm not really sure if a flexible money supply is actually better,
So, kind of yes and no. I think it applies like it does for everything. The problem is not that we have that institutions, but that they have a monopoly. And if you were to abolish the money monopoly and have competing currencies, You just have a market mechanism between the currencies. They could even be fiat currencies, but only the ones that people really trust would prevail, and the others would just fade away. The problem is really the state monopoly, not necessarily the rules. Those would sort themselves out when there's competition.
Yeah, I think we can definitely agree on that. So currency competition is always beneficial, and then we can see what works better. Is gold better? Is Bitcoin better? What do people want? Right now, we don't have currency competition. What I might be interested in now, since you're also an energy expert, is that you were talking about Africa earlier and how there are many regions that don't have any energy and so on. Now there are actually projects in Africa called mini grids. For example, you have a hydroelectric power plant somewhere that's really in the middle of nowhere. For example, you have somewhere there's a hydroelectric power plant that's really in the middle of nowhere. And now there's a problem because there are no power lines going to that hydroelectric plant, and it doesn't have to be a hydroelectric plant. It could also be a wind farm or solar panels, any energy source that isn't constantly available. And if you have a solar panel system there, the energy can't be fed into the grid anywhere. But what's happening now is that a lot of Bitcoin miners are connecting to these solar power plants that are out in the middle of nowhere. And this way, they can actually bring energy to places that might not otherwise be profitable. Because if you just have a solar panel or a wind farm there, all the excess energy just goes to waste since you can't consume it all, you know? So a system like that doesn't pay off very quickly. And in this way, they can also bring energy to places that might not otherwise be amortizable. Because if you have a photovoltaic system or a wind power plant and all the excess energy just goes to waste because you can't use it all 2001, then such a system simply doesn't pay for itself so quickly. And now there's this idea of creating mini grids somewhere in Africa and then even building cities around the Bitcoin mining facilities. Sure, it only works to a certain extent, but at least it can provide some energy to the people. Would you say those are perhaps good approaches, or have you maybe even looked into them already?
I'm a bit skeptical about that because the energy consumption characteristics are very different for each one. So, we've already established that you can turn off a mining rig when it's dark, but cities need a reliable form of energy. And then you have the same investments as well. And then there's the thing that if I put all the energy that's generated, into the data centers or into the computers, people don't benefit from that either. So they need affordable energy and reliable energy, and that's not really achievable with that. Unless you build a lot of special setups around it, like storage solutions, or maybe even have a methanization plant or something like that, that's all conceivable. But the business case for it isn't that great. What actually happened was I was in Ghana in May at a government conference where they talked about the continent's entry into nuclear energy, and they have a lot of respect for it. They say it's a transformational technology because a lot of other things in the country need to happen before they can actually build a nuclear power plant in a sensible way. So, in terms of education, institutions, corruption also needs to go. So, it can't be that I bribe the plant manager and then, as a shift supervisor, I get to drink instead of keeping an eye on the power plant, and your equipment is out of control. They need to become a lot more disciplined, even to the point of military involvement so that certain facilities can be reliably protected and so on. So they are very much aware that it's a transformational form of technology. But they're also developing small networks now, so they can work with medium-sized power plants known as SMRs in the 300 megawatts class to use the energy more effectively. Kenya is building, for example, for all of East Africa, a supergrid connecting the national grid to a cross-border grid network. And Ghana already has a pretty good power grid. Nigeria, it's not exactly the country you have to rush to, but it just happens to be the most populous country in Africa. They have space, so they've massively invested in expanding the grid. They could also accommodate several, up to 10 large power plants in this network and then distribute the energy to the people. So these small islands, that's also getting less due to the grid expansion.
I think I also forgot to mention that the idea was kind of like with the Bitcoin mini grids, where you start off with a lot of mining devices, And as more households get connected, you gradually shut down the mining devices and then bring the households online instead. So you can basically ensure that the payback period goes down. That means the Bitcoin miners are just there to reduce the payback period of such projects. Exactly.
How long does the computer run once you've installed it?
You mean a typical Bitcoin mining device? It depends on how well you maintain it, but some devices last over 10 years. However, they become less efficient as new models emerge. So it's actually going pretty well. But you have to say it gets less efficient over time because there are always newer devices coming out. And if you have an old device, eventually it becomes too inefficient and can't compete anymore. But then you can, for example, heat with the device. For example, there are also Bitcoin mining heaters, which means they just set up a Bitcoin miner in a kind of oven and basically have an electric heating device. Because whether you have a radiator or a Bitcoin miner, they use about the same amount of electricity, but the Bitcoin miner is also mining Bitcoin on the side. In 2021, I read on their homepage, "Go woke, go broke." Could you maybe say a sentence or two about your assessment of the whole woke movement and all that? And I think the Employers Association is involved in that too. Didn't you even write an article about it? But I read it somewhere in your article. Maybe a sentence or two about that.
No, I gave an inaugural speech when I took over as chairman this summer, in 2001, and I talked about how there are, for threats, not just to our economy. We're actually an economic association, but there are also two threats that go straight to the core of our society. And that is wokeism, and that is Islamism. But now, wokeism suggests we were disadvantaged as white male and possibly heterosexual in 2001. We would have been out of luck because we belong to a group of people who are white and male in 2001 and maybe even heterosexual. I don't know about you, but I know about myself. So, we already belong to the group of perpetrators. That works. That's something completely archaic, because even Jesus Christ said 2,000 years ago that we are all equal before God. It doesn't matter which group or class we belong to. And from that, an idea with a huge impact developed in 2001 that we are also equal before the law. And this idea, we could elaborate a lot on it, but that's what defines wokeism at its core. It wants to identify us through groups, and people don't want that, or really just a tiny minority does. And every organization that caters to this tiny minority alienates the majority society. For 70 to 80% of people, it's totally unpopular. They want to lead a self-determined life and not have to define themselves by their group identity. We've really been driven out of that. And that's why organizations that do this, you saw it with Nike and Adidas and with. So, a whole bunch of organizations all the way up to political parties. The left, for example, has really bet heavily on this horse. Or there's Tessa Ganser. I don't know if. So there was a guy in Bavaria who declared himself a woman. And then he got into the Bundestag through the women's quota, because with the Greens, every first, third, and fifth spot on the list has to be filled by a woman. But she quickly declared herself a woman. And now she's sitting in the Bundestag and getting a nice salary for it. But people aren't going to just let that happen, so they turn away from it. And if it is a commercial enterprise, they will go bankrupt. And with a political party, unfortunately, it takes a bit longer for them to go under, but they do lose voter support.
Now they've already touched on the 4 dangers. So where does Islamism fit in what were the other dangers? Can we maybe go through that briefly?
Socialism is really simple. It goes right to the fabric, so to speak, to the core of our Western culture, which is based on personal responsibility. And one variation of that is simply corporatism. By the way, that's exactly what Ulrike Herrmann is calling for. That's actually, in the end, a form of planned economy. We know that markets are by far the most efficient truth-finding instruments. As soon as someone else imposes a truth, it becomes suboptimal. And In socialism, we also know that it has ended in murder and mayhem, poverty, and totalitarianism 100% of the time. And we actually don't want that. Unfortunately, the socialists are always happy to get elected into office. But once they are in office, the question is whether they will ever give up power again. And as long as there were social democrats, real social democrats like the SPD, back in the day, you didn't really have to worry about that. But just look at what's happening in Brazil. Venezuela has already gone down that path, so they're finally starting to collapse. But you can see what's happening in Brazil. Venezuela has already gone down that path, so they're finally starting to collapse. Thousands. Cuba, North Korea are also examples of planned economies where things just go wrong.
Would you say that we first have to let everything fall apart before we can start rebuilding from scratch? Or are there ways to steer the ship back in the current system?
So are we together on this? I truly wish it weren't the case. I wish it could be different. But if it is the way it is, then it's about making people understand which false prophets they've been chasing all this time. And there is no freedom, no individual freedom under socialism. There is no economic freedom, especially not under socialism. One thing leads to another, but people are still looking for freedom and well-being somewhere. And either you learn to change for the better, but most of the time, it seems like a crisis has to happen first. And in Argentina, it's just incredibly amazing and fantastic. So either you learn to change for the better somehow, but most of the time, it seems like a crisis has to happen first. And in Argentina, it's just incredibly amazing and fantastic. I think everyone is a bit euphoric about what Xavier Millet is doing, and he clearly states that he's pursuing an anti-populist agenda. He's not promising the moon. Instead, he says, friends, for the next 2 years, things are going to get worse for you because hidden unemployment is going to become open unemployment. But the rents have, for example, have already dropped because now with the deregulation of the housing market, which is way too regulated in Germany, suddenly a lot of apartments hit the market and the average rent has gone down. That was one of the best news we have heard from Argentina. So it works, the market economy works. And whether we are dealing with how deep the crisis would have to be for it to gain majority support, I cannot really judge, but I actually fear such a scenario that it would have to collapse really badly. But if I really believed that such a scenario was inevitable, I would have somehow moved abroad by now. The fact that I'm getting involved with the German Employers Association, and that I'm also trying to start another company here in Germany. I was indeed a co-founder at Dual Fluid Energy. So I certainly still have a certain level of optimism. I'm also trying to use my inaugural speech and what we can make of it. Maybe to have it available in both German and English in PDF format, so that I can provide some tools for what can be done constructively to overcome these threats and what people need to know to maybe resist the temptations as a result.
If you could give 1 or 2 examples, what are the tools? 1 or 2 examples, briefly.
So when it comes to wokeism, socially problematic ideas, and also Islamism, I pointed out how extremely innovative our Middle Ages were. And we have all forgotten that because the Enlightenment thinkers convinced us that it was a dark time. In fact, these innovations, you can read about them there, and I don't want to overstretch myself here. Here's my hospitality. They contributed to the Christian West, becoming the absolutely dominant culture in the world in the last millennium, and we have forgotten that. That's why we're not fighting for it anymore and just letting it all slip away so easily. My recipe against degrowth, I call it ecological realism, and I actually developed it myself. I'm trying to write a book about it, but I actually still need a 5-figure amount for our organization to make this happen. So maybe we can also see, if someone says, This is really important to me. I'd like to support it. Sure.
So if someone is interested, the email is down below. Just shoot me a message.
Okay, very good. Let's link everything. The concept of ecological realism is what I've developed to have a truly positive countermodel to the energy transition and to all these degrowth advocates, where everyone knows it won't be socially feasible at all. And totalitarian systems eventually collapse. And besides, poor societies, once they've collapsed, are the worst for the environment. The environment thrives where people are doing well. This can be wonderfully backed up with empirical evidence. And the main idea of ecological realism is that we need three things from nature, and somehow we get into conflict with them. That's food, raw materials, and energy. We've been harvesting that from nature since ancient times. So if we want to have 8 or soon 10 or 11 billion people living in energy abundance and prosperity, instead of 3 billion people in energy poverty, that should be our humanistic goal in line with the 17 UN Sustainable Development Goals. We need technologies that have 3 key characteristics to obtain food, energy, and raw materials. And they need to be compact, using as few resources and as little land as possible. Secondly, they need to be as circular as possible, so that we produce as little waste as we can. It's never completely without, but those technologies do exist. And they also need to be cost-effective. That's what we have in Germany, and that was the start of our conversation. We keep making everything expensive, but that won't change anything in the world. It will only change when you have a cheaper, emissions-free power plant. Only then will people buy it. Nowadays, a coal power plant is still inaugurated every week, and that's when we can start to change things. Only then will we eliminate coal. These days, a coal power plant is still inaugurated somewhere in the world every week, and that's when we can start to change things. Only then will we get rid of the coal, which causes so many respiratory diseases and so on. We'll only get rid of coal when we have affordable alternatives that are also low in emissions.
I can really recommend that. I also checked out their homepage and went through everything. There are really some very, very interesting articles there. What I also found really fascinating was what you mentioned about Islamism. You gave a speech about it and said that in a few years, the birth rates of the Islamic population will be so high that we're facing a kind of population switch. I actually wanted to wrap this up, but can we maybe touch on that just briefly? And if you want to buy Bitcoin now, feel free to check out 21 Bitcoin, the easiest way to buy Bitcoin in Europe. With the code bitcoinhotel, you can get up to 20% off the fees when buying Bitcoin. And to secure your Bitcoin as much as possible, I recommend a TREZOR hardware wallet. This way, you can be sure that you're protected from theft and hacking attacks. A TREZOR wallet is super easy to use, secure, and even open source. And with the code bitcoinhotel, you can also get 10% off when buying a hardware wallet. I'll link you below in the video description to TREZOR and 21 Bitcoin.
Yeah, no, I just said that Islam doesn't have a Middle Ages, so they are still essentially an ancient belief system. It had an incredible rise between 600-something and 1200. Then it stagnated for 200 years. And since 1400, it's really been on the decline. They don't really have any true intellectuals, or hardly any left, but there's a strong turn back to their ancient roots, of a god-king system and all that. The question is, if they succeed, who's going to build their phones or cars or whatever? Because they can't manage all that themselves, since they lack the prerequisites in their ancient way of thinking to really engage in natural sciences and seriously pursue technology. Most Muslims know that too. So when they're in the Gulf region, they definitely know what they get from Western influence. If this archaic version of Islamism were to prevail, it would really mean the end of human civilization. But maybe we shouldn't be so afraid, because you could say, they'll turn it away out of self-interest. But that's my point. They have better birth rates, even in Germany. And it's precisely the more archaic people in Islam who are having more children. So purely the shift in demographics is a threat. And that's why we really need to be careful about who we let into the country and what people are doing here. I'm actually a big fan of Islam. I have looked into it a lot and think there are a lot of exciting and good things about it. But Islam needs a reform before it can catch up in the 21st century. And not a caliphate, like I said, an ancient theocracy that might have been the right form of government thousands of years ago. Century. And not a caliphate, like I said, an ancient theocratic monarchy that might have been the right form of government thousands of years ago.
When would the tipping point be? Can we say it's 10 years, or when does it tip, so that Islam has more of the population here in Germany than the Germans do? Is there really a tipping point?
In England and France, there are already certain neighborhoods that are no-go areas. Even in Sweden, they have neighborhoods like that in Germany. The question is whether that will. So when that spreads to the majority society, and then it's really game over here, and we really need to actively fight against such thinking, becoming mainstream here. So, I'm not just talking about civil war, quite the opposite. We need to intellectually arm ourselves. We need to learn again, relearn what made the Christian West great. There are a few clues in my inaugural speech, as I said. And you have to stand up to people and say, I'm not with you on this. That can help pull some of them out of these old ideas that are harmful. We've built something amazing in the West. And maybe that way, you can gradually pull some of them out of these very archaic thought structures that are really destructive and not constructive. And we've really built something sensational in the West. We've basically freed all the people in the world from poverty for the first time in human history. That wouldn't really be thinkable without Christianity. Christianity has so many great ideas that most people are too lazy to think about, or maybe even too arrogant. That wouldn't really be thinkable without Christianity. So Christianity has a lot of great ideas that most people are too lazy to think about, or maybe even too arrogant. You also come across that. But in reality, there is equality before the law, the separation of church and state, which is extremely important. Jesus said, "Give to Caesar what is Caesar's, and to God what is God's." 2001. So he did, and that was said in a certain context, but the effect was that church and state were separated. And that's a good thing.
MHM. So yeah, 5. Tolerant is MHM. Yes, definitely highly explosive. So, I definitely want to thank you for being here. That was super interesting, really exciting. So, drop us a comment about what you think of those statements. Should we invite Dr. Björn Peters back, the energy expert? Then you have the last words if you want to do a little promotional segment. Björn Peters, should we invite him back, the energy expert? Then you have the last words if you want to do a little promotional segment. Or where should people go? Where can they find information? Exactly, I thank you, and you have the last words.
Okay, so I already mentioned it. I would really appreciate support for our work at the German Employers Association. We have some really good projects to bring the idea, for example, to bring the idea of a market economy into young minds. We could do things like that, but we're just a small volunteer organization and we appreciate donations. Thank you.
Awesome. Thanks for watching, folks. See you later. I'm signing off. Peace out. 1000.